Is powerful truth in these verses that we have read this morning. Truth that reaches from the beginning of creation into eternity future. And when we begin to understand the truth that God is unfolding here in the second chapter of the book of Genesis, we begin to see something of the majesty and the glory and the grandeur of His redemptive purpose in Jesus Christ. We saw last week that it was man's unique role to be the only creature in all of creation that was made both from the earthly and the heavenly. We are made of the dust, but God has breathed into us the breath of life. And though our physical frame is derived from the dust of the ground, God has given us and imparted to us that heavenly life, that heavenly breath, if you will, that makes us capable and able to bear both the image and the glory of our Creator. So we saw in the creation narrative of Adam last week that God created or formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And we understand from that we are dust, but we were created for glory. In the text that lies before us this morning, in Genesis chapter 2, describes in verses 8 through 14, describes the surroundings into which man was originally placed when he was created. It describes his environment, if you will, the environment into which this creature Adam, who was created with the ability to bear the glory of God and to worship and have relationship with God. He was placed into a very detailed environment. I had Jeremy read for you passages from Revelation chapters 21 and 22 about the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, because there's some fascinating things in those passages. In that those passages, all the way at the end of the inspired Word of God, seem to be aware, if you will, of an earlier interpretation of Eden as a sanctuary or a temple where God was worshiped. Think about some of the statements that John makes in Revelation when he says, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man." Does that ring any bells from what we understand about Eden at this point? When he says that an angel took him away in the Spirit to a great and a high mountain and showed me the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, there is significance there that connects back to the Garden of Eden. And then there's the garden-like features that you see, and there are a number of them, but just a couple to point out here. First of all, in the New Jerusalem, there is a source of water. The angel showed John a river of the water of life that was flowing out from the throne of God and from the Lamb. And we saw in our text this morning that there in Eden, that there was this magnificent river that flowed out of Eden and then divided into 4 rivers that watered the whole of the land. In the Revelation passage, John apparently sees an arboreal garden, if you will, an orchard of trees that line both sides of this river of life that is flowing out of the throne of God. He says on either side of the river there was the tree of life, and with it its 12 kinds of fruit. And we come back to our text in Genesis here, and we see that there is a tree of life that God places in the very midst of the garden. So you hear the echoes of Eden all the way at the end of Revelation that is prophesying of the end of time as we know it. You hear these echoes of Eden. We could say that John's description of the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, is really a description of a city temple. in Revelation chapters 21 and 22, and we see that John's description is weighted very heavily with strong allusions to the Garden of Eden in these texts that we find in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3. What I want to do this morning is to look at these passages from Genesis chapter 2 under 4 headings. First of all, we will look at the sanctuary temple features of the original creation. And we will just look at a handful of them so you can get the gist of what is going on here. And then secondly, we're going to look at how these temple or sanctuary features were then duplicated in Solomon's temple that was built there in Jerusalem. Then we're going to look at how the prophets, especially the later prophets, how those prophets viewed these temple or sanctuary features that were found both in Eden and in Solomon's temple. We're going to look at how those prophets viewed those in their prophecies of an end time temple. And then we're going to demonstrate how all of this culminates in the book of Revelation and in this beatific vision that John sees of the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. So first, let's look at the sanctuary or the temple features. Now you understand when I use the word sanctuary, I'm using it in the typical Old Testament sense, and that when I say that Eden was a sanctuary, it was that it was a place where man was placed and put to worship God and to have relationship with Him. A sanctuary is a place where worship takes place. First of all, we see that Eden was the unique place of God's presence. That is a primary feature of the worship of God, is that God be in the midst of and presencing Himself with those who are worshiping Him. We see this in Genesis chapter 3, that Adam and Eve were familiar with God's being in their midst as they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. What's very interesting about the Hebrew word that is used for the verb walking there is that it really depicts the idea of walking back and forth and up and down. It's not just that he was strolling through the garden, but he was diffusing and effusing His presence throughout the garden. He was present everywhere there in that garden. Another interesting point about the Garden of Eden is the very name of the garden. You know what the term Eden means in Hebrew? It means literally pleasure and delight. It's the idea that in the presence of God, Adam and Eve experienced pleasure and delight and had satisfaction for their souls. You see this idea played out in Psalm 16, verse 11, where the psalmist says of God, "You make known to me the path of life, and in your presence is" what? "Fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore." So we see God in Eden presencing Himself with Adam and Eve, presencing Himself with His creation, and they deriving pleasure and delight from that presence of God. Secondly, we see that there is a mountain orientation to the Garden of Eden. And I had never picked this up before until about a month ago. There is a mountain orientation to the Garden of Eden. This is something that we miss because we often don't understand the culture of the Old Testament, but it was very typical in the early Mesopotamian cultures for these kings, these sovereigns, these suzerains as they were called, to build their palatial dwelling, their palaces and fortresses up on the top.